So, hello everybody. Welcome to our fourth and final panel of the day, where we have been given the task of, I believe, Professor Curtice may be challenging our task, to work out where British politics is going and what the prospects are for the next general election. I'm Paula Surridge. I'm Deputy Director at UKICE Europe, and I am joined by four people who will be excellent to take us on this journey to see where British politics is going. I have Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, also Senior Fellow at NatSen and one of UKICE Europe's Senior Fellows. Also joined by Beaver, Chief Executive at Ipsos UK and a Fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences. And when reading Kelly's bio, the thing that I found most interesting was that you were leading the REACT study during COVID. So I did. That was a particularly interesting thing to be doing at that time. I'm also joined by Sebastian Payne, Director at Onward UK, and previously political editor at the Financial Times, and author of two recent books, Broken Heartlands, which is about the Red Wall, and the more recent Fall of Boris Johnson, which perhaps is also in some ways about the Red Wall.
Exactly, it's the rise and fall. I should say I was white editor of the FT. I wouldn't want to upset the great George Parker.
Sorry. And finally, Peter Kyle MP, who is the MP for Hove and Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. So thank you, a great panel to take us through the topic. We're going to begin slightly unusually for one of UKICE's panels, in that we're going to start off with some presentations, because I think in a topic like this, where we're talking about the polling and where things are going, you can really only grasp some of this stuff by seeing some of the numbers for yourself. So I apologise if there are any number phobes in the room. It is okay to look away if you really want to. And I'll hand over to Sir John.
Thank you very much, Paula. I have to admit, as sophologists, Kelly and I, we really cannot do without our slides. In any case, I have to say, having sat through most of this conference, I still haven't quite decided whether that's the jury in the court or the dog. But it does have a certain resonance to it in this rather august building. Anyway, we're meant to be talking about the state of British politics after Brexit. And of course, being an awkward academic, I thought perhaps the interesting thing to do was to ask whether or not Brexit is still part of our politics, i.e. whether or not the presumption that we have now moved into a post-Brexit era, so far as British politics is concerned, is actually accurate. Now, of course, if we want to address that question, we have to define what we mean by a post-Brexit politics. And I've picked out three aspects. Of course, we're now focusing on public opinion. There are other aspects to do with elite behaviour and politics, etc. we might want to add to this. But number one is, and we heard quite a lot about this, particularly 18 months, 2 years ago, voters, and including, and that probably really meant especially, Remainers, are no longer concerned about or interested in Brexit. It's yesterday's issue. And people have accommodated themselves to the fact that the United Kingdom has left the European Union, the debate is over, and we're all ready to move on. Second way in which we might have a post-Brexit politics is that the issue doesn't really account for the rises and falls in party support. That however popular any individual party is, in the end, doesn't really have a great deal to do with Brexit. And the third, which isn't quite the same thing, is Brexit no longer shapes the pattern of party support. So the second is about the level of support. The third is about relationships. It's about to what extent do people with different views about Brexit support our different political parties. Now, we can probably dispose of the second one relatively easily. If we look at what's happened to the popularity of the parties in the polls since December 2019, it's been a very unusual parliament. It's been a parliament which until November/December 2021 seemed to break the rules of electoral politics. That is, we had a government that had never been consistently behind the opposition in the polls, even though normally we expect governments to hit trouble in midterm and then to recover thereafter. But since basically the first release by ITV News of allegations surrounding Partygate, the government has been behind. It has never recovered. It made things worse when they replaced Boris Johnson with Liz Truss. And while there's been some recovery, not a lot. I've not mentioned the word Brexit in any of that. And so let's acknowledge straight away that certainly rises and falls in party support have much more to do with things like whether or not you think your politicians are telling the truth or whether or not you think they can run the economy or not. And indeed, just on that latter comment, we can see how perceptions of the government's economic competence, what we in the trade call a classic valence issue. People will vote for the government if they think they're running the economy well. They won't for it if they think it's doing badly. We can see the hit that the government's reputation for economic competence took, certainly in the wake of the Liz Truss fiscal event, but indeed actually even before that, in the 12 to 18 months in the run-up to that, confidence in the government's handling of the economy was beginning to fall away, as indeed inflation at that stage was already beginning to rise. So that second criterion about does it account for the rises and falls in party support, largely the answer to that question is no. But it's the other two that I now want to pursue. Have voters given up, forgotten about, no longer interested in Brexit, particularly on the Remain side? And secondly, does Brexit no longer shape the pattern of party support? Now, I want you to remember, by the way, the fact that the Conservatives were ahead of Labour in the polls for the first 2 years. It's quite important to being able to interpret what's about to follow. So let's track through, do the most obvious thing so far as addressing the pattern of party support is concerned, by tracking how those who voted Leave in 2016, and in a moment I will do Remain as well, say they will now vote. Three things to pick out from this. Number one is that the Leave end of the Conservative coalition, which of course was the fundamental foundation of Boris Johnson's success in December 2019. Boris Johnson won the 2019 general election because he got the vast bulk of those people who were in favour of Brexit to vote for him, whereas the Remain vote was fragmented. But you can see, even when the Conservatives were still ahead of Labour in the polls, support for the Conservatives amongst Leave voters was already somewhat fragile, and when the Conservative vote fell, it was amongst Leave voters that it fell. Given that backdrop, it isn't therefore perhaps terribly surprising, though the one thing that's definitely happened in the last 12 months is that starting off with Partygate, but then in the wake of the Liz Truss event, the willingness of Leave voters to vote for the Conservative Party has fallen away dramatically. To that extent, at least, it looks as though the pattern of party support really isn't being governed by Brexit anymore. Second thing to note is that even though the Labour Party in the early months and years of this Parliament was not making much progress overall in the polls, it was at least making a bit of progress amongst Leave voters. There was already, Leave voters defined as how they voted in 2016, there were already signs that Leave voters were somewhat more likely to switch back to Labour than perhaps the public in general. But that said, notice that Labour's real gains amongst Leave voters only occur in the wake of the Liz Truss fiscal event. And that obviously raises a question about the extent to which Labour's gains amongst Leave voters more recently is to do with the fact the Labour Party is now saying we accept Brexit, or is it to do with the fact that the government is thought to have fouled up, not least economically, as I've already shown. How does that compare with the pattern amongst Remain voters? Well, the first thing you will note is that, well, whatever gains Labour have made amongst those who voted Leave, still got lots more people who voted Remain in 2016 are still voting for it. But that said, progress Labour have made amongst this group fairly anemic. I mean, it's 5 points higher at the moment than it was in 2019, whereas amongst Leave voters, Labour is now 16 points higher than it was back in 2019. So it really does look as though Labour has made significant relative progress amongst Leave voters. You can also notice, by the way, how incredibly loyal Tory Remainers have been throughout this Parliament. With the exception of the immediate wake of the Liz Truss fiscal event, basically that 1/5 of people who voted Remain in 2016 and were willing to vote for Boris Johnson in 2019, they are for the most part largely still with the Conservative Party. So that looks as though it does seem to suggest that, well, actually, yes, there are still differences in the pattern of party support. The Conservatives have lost ground heavily amongst Leave voters, but they still got more Leave voters than Remain voters, and the opposite being true for Labour. But it really does look as though the pattern of party support has changed fairly dramatically. That said, let's switch back for the moment to that first criteria, which is whether or not voters, including Remainers, are no longer concerned about, interested in Brexit. We all accept that Brexit is done. This is tracking all of the opinion polls that have asked people how they would vote, and for the last 18 months or so, they've all been whether you would vote to rejoin or stay out. But how that has tracked since the conclusion of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement at the end of 2021. The orange line are those who would vote to stay out. The grey line are those who would vote to stay in. And you can see in the immediate wake of the conclusion of the TCA, what had been immediately before that was a bit of nervousness amongst voters, because you remember the TCA only emerged on Christmas Eve in 2021, a week before it was meant to be coming into place. But once that was concluded, we got back to a situation where about 52% of people were in favour of staying out of the European Union. But you will notice that by the time we get to the autumn of 2021, we are back to a situation where we have a majority, albeit a narrow majority, saying they would vote to rejoin. What happens in the autumn of 2021? This is the first time when Brexit really becomes a negative news story. It's when we didn't have enough lorry drivers to fill the supermarket shelves, allegedly, and the petrol stations, and the stories about the abattoir workers and we couldn't kill our pigs, etc., first began to emerge. But then you will then notice that subsequently, and we're now really beginning to look into the autumn of 2022 through 2023, we've had a fairly consistent pattern of around 57% of people saying they would vote to rejoin and 43% to stay out. Little sign here that Remain voters have accepted that Brexit is done and that they've perhaps been joined by some other people as well. Indeed, we can see what's been going on in this next slide, where I'm comparing how those people who said that what they did in 2016. So Remain refers to Remain voters in 2016, Leave refers to Leave voters in 2016, and didn't votes refer to those who didn't vote. So you're going to start with that group. This is a much ignored but crucial group. This group has long been fairly strongly in favour of being inside the European Union. The principal reason why, as early as December 2019, or indeed earlier in 2019, there was actually in the opinion polls a majority of people in favour of remaining in the European Union, as the position then was the fact that those people who didn't vote in 2016, some of whom of course were too young to vote in 2016, were overwhelmingly in favour of being inside the European Union. But that said, as recently as 18 months ago, most people hadn't changed their minds about Brexit, and that is still true, by the way, amongst those who voted. But you can see that actually Remain voters were indeed a bit less likely to say, yeah, well, I will go through the pain of all of this and I would like to rejoin, than Leave voters were to say they vote to stay out. But that has now changed. Remain voters are now somewhat more likely to say they would vote to rejoin than Leave voters are they would to stay out. So certainly so far as my first criterion is concerned, it is very difficult to argue that Brexit is over and that we are in an era of post-Brexit politics. But what implications does this potentially have for how our understanding of the relationship between party support and attitudes towards Brexit? Well, one of the things it means is we shouldn't rely on what people said in 2016. This is beginning to be an out-of-date measure. It's also a misleading measure for a couple of other reasons that I won't go into detail now in terms of slide. But number one, that group of people there who said they didn't vote in 2016, they're overwhelmingly pro-Labour. And yes, they're overwhelmingly pro-Remain. Second thing you can see is that amongst those people who voted Leave in 2016 but voted Labour in 2019, if they are still with Labour, there's now quite a high probability that they're in favour of rejoining the European Union. In other words, people whose views on Brexit were out of view with their vote in 2019 have tended to move their attitude on Brexit towards the view of their party. And the third thing one can also see is that amongst those people who voted Conservative in 2019 and who voted Leave in 2016, those who have changed their minds about Brexit are more likely to have switched to Labour and the Liberal Democrats than are those Conservative Leavers who have remained true to the faith. If you think about it, you put all those things together, you can see how the relationship between current Brexit preference and current party support doesn't necessarily look quite the same as what I showed you earlier. Now, some of it is still there. You can still see that even on this measure, of course, the Conservatives are losing ground very heavily amongst Leave voters. But you will now see that the relative progress that Labour has made amongst Leave voters, it's still there, but it's not as dramatic as you might have thought, because actually Labour has been quite successful at picking up the votes of people who have either changed their minds about Brexit or didn't vote in 2016 in the first place. So that narrows the gap between the rejoiners and the stay-outs. That, I say that parenthetically, I will simply say it is not obvious what the Liberal Democrats have got out of staying stum on Brexit. They've done a pretty good job at losing support amongst rejoiners, and they have not compensated for gains amongst those who voted stay out. In the case of Labour, you can still argue that their strategy was successful. But then what you can do with this information and what we know about what was the position in 2019, we can actually then use this information to estimate how the balance of support for being inside or outside the European Union has changed since the 2019 general election. So, yep, there's been a big change for the Conservatives. Nearly 1 in 3 Conservative voters, by the way, now are people who are in favour of remaining inside the European Union, of rejoining the European Union, because the rejoiners have been faithful, it's the Leavers who have gone. The Liberal Democrats, their level of support amongst Remainers has fallen quite sharply. Fascinatingly, the one party whose Brexit profile has changed the least since 2019 is the party that's been electorally most successful since 2019, and that is Labour. But you can see that the next Labour government, if indeed it is the next Labour government, is at the moment still very heavily backed by a coalition of voters that is overwhelmingly pro-rejoin, and I'll leave Peter to tell us how the next Labour administration will deal with the politics of that when he makes his contribution.
It's a dramatic ending.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to Kelly, who I think is going to show us some more data that will take the story a little bit further, maybe?
Perhaps. I think, so John, we had 5 minutes each, so given your lead, I'm going to take my time. It's great to be with you all today. Some of what I'm going to say will hopefully resonate with what you've also said, Sir John, but also I hope think a little bit more about what this all means for the next general election in likely 2024. And I thought I would just lead with 5 reflections because we were given 5 minutes, but I will take longer probably also. Firstly, as you just heard, Brexit really is no longer a top-of-mind priority. This is our Issues Index, which is a very long-running, unprompted question to the British public, and they tell us what they think the biggest issues are facing Britain today. And as you can see, Brexit is number 10 on this list. Now you have inflation, the economy, and the NHS written large at the top. In fact, now we have only 7% of Britons who say that Brexit, they believe, is the biggest issue facing the country, and it has pretty much been that way for almost a year. But I want to take you back to think about when this was a big issue, just to remind you of how far it has actually fallen. Back in the heady days of the Theresa May premiership, the last few months, we were routinely seeing 7 in 10 in the British public saying this was the biggest issue that was facing our society. But between then and today, you can see the steam has gone out of it. There were a few peaks at moments when deadlines were extended and when we legally left Europe, but actually now we are sitting at that 7%. Which is why when I read the exam question, I also thought, well, maybe I'll tweak that a little bit. It's less about Brexit as an entity in itself, but more about how people really feel the process is going that we need to investigate more thoroughly today. And the short answer, and you will see this from lots and lots of pollsters, not just Ipsos, is that the view is predominantly negative. In the polling that we do, where we ask people how they think Brexit is going, since October last year, we have seen that more than half, a sort of narrow majority in the country, are now saying that they think Brexit was a bad decision. Why is this? Are we actually seeing people switching from die-hard leavers to dyed-in-the-wool remainers? Well, no, the divide is actually far more nuanced, as you also heard in the previous presentation. What you see on the screen are the 7 tribes of Brexit, which we unpicked back in 2021, and I actually presented at another one of Paula and Anand's events. And what you can see here is one end of the spectrum, you have our liberal Remainers who are economically left-wing, culturally liberal, right through to the traditionalist leavers at the top middle box there. But actually, what's likely to be happening is not that those individual groups are moving substantively, but the politically disengaged, the young middle British, and also the entrepreneurial young are more shifting closer to seeing Brexit as a bad idea. And instead of not really noticing, they are now noticing some of the impacts that they can see, and they can really sense that they're feeling that it is a bad idea. My next reflection really is a little bit on the extent to which there are opportunities to deliver Brexit better and to be perceived as delivering Brexit better. And at the minute what we do see is that public views on Brexit, they seem to be also guided by their views of overall government competence and overall government delivery. But they do have views on what they think the priorities should be moving forward. The top 3 here are 3 I would just like to flag. They have clear priorities. Improving trade, 4 in 10 of both Leave and Remain groups are saying that this is the top issue for them. Reducing illegal immigration is the second here, but top priority for those who voted Leave and far smaller issue for Remainers. And then fighting crime and terrorism, which is a key priority across the board. So my third reflection is actually on whether people believe the current government of the day can deliver competently, which is a key reflection not just on Brexit but more broadly as they go into the home straight for the next 12 months in the run-up to an election. And actually, you'll know this from any polling data you look at, but the Conservative brand is incredibly damaged at this point in time. The proportion of voters who think that the Conservative government understand the problems Britons face, the proportion who think they're fit to govern, or indeed have a good team of leaders, has dropped substantively since the point of the 2019 election. Only 1/5 of the public now say that they would use the word competent to describe the government at the minute. But this perception, it is across a wider range of metrics. 2/3 of voters say that the next election is a time where they want to see change, and almost half say that they would be worse off if the Conservatives won the next election, compared to only 1/3 who would say that for Labour. So you can see there's a real brand damage issue, and it is linked to competence, fitness to govern, and delivery. And the fourth reflection reflects a little bit on Labour, because they have made big strides towards being perceived as being electable. 44% saying Labour is ready to form the next government, which is up substantively since September 2021. And it's a similar sort of number to that which we saw for David Cameron in April 2010. But there are signs that they haven't quite convinced the public yet. And some of the more recent polling is starting to show the voting intention leads narrow for Labour. And we can also see, we know people vote on policies, the parties and also on the leaders. And when it comes to the leadership, Keir Starmer is tied with Rishi Sunak on leader image. Similar numbers think that he would make a capable PM. Similar numbers are satisfied with his job. So this isn't necessarily an area where Labour are taking a lead, and it is a potential area of strength for the Conservatives. And I think Seb might touch a little bit about the strong appeal of Sunak in the 20-somethings, perhaps in his reflections. And my last reflection, which is on delivery. Both leaders have emphasised their ability to get things done, which makes delivery a really key focus for the next election. But Sunak, he has his work cut out. This is our recent polling looking at how the public perceive the Conservative government, led by Rishi Sunak, is doing in terms of a good job or bad job delivering the pledges. It's not a glowing scorecard by any stretch of the imagination. But what we can see and what we do know is that he is focusing on the right things. The economy really matters. And in fact, when we've looked in more recent data ourselves at Conservative switchers, there's little to categorise them in demography together. But what we can see is that their negative views of government performance and the economy is something that really does unite them. So a narrow path to Sunak victory could be his ability to navigate and shift some of the perceptions overall on their overall levels of competency, rather than just focusing on targeting specific demographics, because that won't be enough. So 3 quick summaries. Delivery, I think, will be the watchword for an election in 2024. Brexit is not an exception to this, and actually the public are not positive at the minute, and there is an opportunity to do better. The public know what they want to see from Brexit. And then thirdly, divides still do exist, but the challenges go much beyond Brexit, and I think you heard that from both myself and John. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to hand over to Seb in just a second, but if I could remind you just to vote for the questions you would like asked on the Slido, because there are some very big questions there, and if I start delving into them, any one of them might take up the rest of the panel, so make sure that you vote for the ones you'd like me to ask. And that I'll hand over to Seb.
Thank you very much, and absolutely fascinating research from John Kelly there. My reflections are, first of all, start with a quote that has been used so often, it is obviously a cliche, which is, of course, Lord Palmerston, who said, the first rule of good foreign policy is good policy at home. And I think that's going to be the big theme of how foreign policy plays into the next general election campaign, that Brexit is the dissonance between what you hear in Westminster and on certain social media sites and what we at Onward pick up in our focus group and polling is really quite stark. And I think Kelly highlighted this when you were looking at the issues about where it comes, that, you know, if you have any conversation about any domestic or international matter in Westminster, it will nearly always mention Brexit at some point. If you went out into, I guess what Lee Anderson would call the real world, you will almost certainly never hear it from people, that it's not something they think about, they don't want to think about it, and it's only when you start to probe and needle it, you start to get the regrets that have come across in some of the things that John mentioned there. When we look towards the next election, which we assume will be later next year, probably September, October 2024, although one can't rule out a snap election in the spring, I imagine that Brexit will not feature heavily for all the reasons that we've heard about. I think for Labour Party, and I'm sure Peter will pick up on this, its best option is to say as little as possible, because it still divides its electoral coalition, and even though there is huge pressure from some MPs and from its activist base to reopen the question and to be bolder on this, and I think Lord Mandelson is the sort of person who would like to see Labour being bolder, as would Alistair Campbell. I don't really see how it's in its Labour's electoral interest to do that at the moment its best thing is to say as little as possible, and I think the slogan is make Brexit work, and that speaks to all the sentiments we've heard from the data. For the Conservatives, I think it will be to as and when to remind people of the cultural divide that is there, and John obviously said that it's not a dividing issue in the way that it certainly was in 2019, but it can be a conduit to talking about characters. So of course you will be sick of hearing by polling day how many times Keir Starmer voted for another referendum or for the single market or whatever it is, not because it's salient with voters, but because it reminds people of his background and his character and those messages the Conservatives want to get across. But in policy terms, there is a big deadline coming up after the next election, which is the TCA, which is coming up for renewal in 2025. And it's going to be quite remarkable. We'll have an election campaign where no one's going to talk about it. No one's going to actually be saying, well, how would you change it? And if there are election debate, it's not really in Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer's interest to say, well, I would want to change this or do that. And I'm sure somewhere buried in a filing cabinet at Labour Party HQ, there will be some ideas on how they would like to reshape the TCA. But it's not within their electoral interest, I think, to talk about that right now. And I think if the Conservatives get back in, they may well have things they want to revisit in the TCA, because we've learned quite a lot since it was first signed. But again, it will not be a major thing. The most striking thing from Kelly's observations is obviously the presidential style election that we are now heading towards in the UK, because for the Conservatives, their best hope is to put Rishi Sunak front and centre. And I'm obviously going to mention the research Onward had out last week about millennials, which are my generation, people who sort of still think they're vaguely young but are not really, of 25 to 40-year-olds. And as we identified in that work, they are the first generation in history to not become more instinctively right-wing as they get older. Normally, as people get jobs, buy houses, have families, and eventually withdraw pensions, they will tend to chart centre-right in their world outlook. It is not happening with millennials, and you can look at the financial crisis and the fact that my generation, who I graduated in 2010, my whole working career has been in the wake of the financial crisis. It's also mirrored with the time the Conservatives have been in power, and for many millennials, they look at that and feel like things could be better. When we did sentiment analysis about how they felt towards parties, it was astounding, the views that came across for the Conservatives versus Labour. And if you want to get more details, then you can find it on UKonward.com, another very good think tank. But I think for Labour Party as well, there are still some latent brand things they need to deal with. And I think, again, that is why there's an argument Keir Starmer will be put straight into the front of the election campaign. So in some ways, it's going to be a very different election for the last couple ones that we've had, that the Conservatives trying to put and successfully put Boris Johnson front and centre in 2019 and 2017. The Conservatives tried it with Theresa May. We all remember Strong and Stable, and that went very well. And in 2015, again, I think you could see the Conservatives trying to put David Cameron ahead of the party. So we are in some ways going a bit more back to normal on that front. But ultimately, the next election is going to be about the bread and butter issues that Kelly highlighted there, and many of them do have a Brexit element to them, but I don't see there being much discussion of it. So it feels like it's sort of almost the calm before the storm, and it will be interesting if Labour does win the next election about how you deal with that within government, because the pressure from activists, but also MPs who I think instinctively with the pro-Remain side of the Labour electorate will try and make that voice heard. Maybe it's the TCA negotiation, maybe it's a whole bunch of side deals you could look to do on things like data or alignment. So I think if Labour gets in, my feeling is there will be more alignment with the EU, and it will be a very interesting question for the Conservatives how they deal with that. If they win the election, then I think it'll be very much business as usual, and we'll see how these trends develop. So there's my reflections on it. Some excellent thoughts.
Thank you. I feel almost...
Thank you. It wasn't that bad, okay.
I do feel almost duty-bound, though, to say other think tanks are available. If I hand over now to Peter to round off our set of reflections. Thank you for voting up the questions. I can now see much more about what the audience would like me to answer.
Are we allowed to vote as to which questions we'd like to answer?
Well, there's a couple I'd quite like to answer. I could do that.
You just like voting because you have so much business out of it. So thank you very much for having me here today. It's great to talk about these things. Some people seem to say that we don't like talking about Brexit. Actually, we do, but we like talking about it and framing it into the future. I think there is so much in these two presentations that we just had on the data and the polling that my brain is just firing in too many directions. There's so much I want to say. I'm now going to have to be more disciplined than I usually am in trying to stay focused, because there's so much richness in the data that we've had. There is so much going on at the moment. My first thought was, I really enjoyed your presentation, John, as I always do. I was so glad that Kelly started with that list, because that was going to be my first point, the list of voter priorities. And I think if you'd gone down even deeper into those voter priorities, you would have found that the first one, inflation, interest rates, and cost of living related issues, it's not just 1, 2, 3, it's 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, then 2, 3. The economy at the moment is absolutely, far and away the issue which has connected with voters. Other issues, tower into insignificance compared to it. So being number 10 on that list is really quite something. So sometimes we have conversations about one particular subject, we go very, very deep into it, but actually when it comes to what voters actually expect their political parties who aspire to govern to talk about the most, actually it's something quite different. So it's good to put that into context. I'm kind of reminded, I'm not a parent, but so all the parents in the room will know the book I'm talking about, because I don't. I just remember when I was reading to my nieces that children's story book where there's this sort of furry monster rampaging around the universe, and then suddenly, wreaking terror everywhere, and then suddenly it lands on Earth, and it's about that big. And I think we're in danger for those people who have a very strident view either side of the Brexit debate, and they still want to talk about it in the same terms as we did before we left the EU and before that momentous 2019 general election. Need to bear that in mind when it comes to voters. Actually, it is that animal that crashed to earth and actually was smaller than somebody's foot, and we need to be very aware of that as we move forward. So, in terms of moving forward, when we went into the local elections the local elections that's just passed, we've done so much reflection as a party. We've done so much thinking about these issues, because it wasn't just an organisational loss, the 2019 general election, which I thought was an irresponsible general election. It was also quite emotional for us, because for Labour to lose so decisively in places like Stoke, deindustrialised, post-industrial communities that the Labour Party was born from, was actually quite an existential thing for us. So for us to start reconnecting in those areas actually was hugely important for us. But it was also on the back of a huge amount of self-reflection. Keir's first steps to winning in places like Stoke weren't, let's compartmentalise the electorate and let's just try and offer policies to each one of the subgroups. The first thing we did was fix our party, because our party was in a mess after the 2019 election. And we knew that we wouldn't even get a hearing on policy unless we dealt with the issues that Keir had inherited. Bearing in mind, we were at -20 in the polls on the day that Keir became leader of the Labour Party. So dealing with issues like anti-Semitism in the party, dealing with issues about how we select candidates, dealing with issues about how we transacted our politics right from the top, right the way through to our membership, was the fundamental first step. Because we're always very aware that Boris Johnson is often forgotten, that in that 2019 general election, he was the least popular serving Prime Minister going into a general election. And yet he trounced Labour. So just because you have an unpopular opponent doesn't mean that people are going to turn to the biggest alternative or the most credible, the most obvious alternative. We know that in our bones now. So we knew that we had a fundamental job to rebuild our party before we could go back. The second thing that I want to say is that this bit about just compartmentalising the electorate, we didn't just do that. What we did was we focused on the core offer that we have as a party. We have rebuilt the purpose of the Labour Party for the 2020s going forward. Front and centre, it is the cost of living. Nobody's mentioned Labour's policy intervention last summer, where we came up with the windfall tax and all of the policies that flowed from it. That was a big solution to a big problem, but it was also sensible, credible, and endorsed by stakeholder organisations and economic organisations. These were big moments on the pathway to where we were, to how we won in the local elections just gone. So doing the core, in other words, the core rebuilding of the party, repurposing our core offer to the electorate is what has got us back into the game. Because what we can't do is just think, well, Leavers want this, Remainers want this, people in the North East want that, people in the South East, business people need this, people who are working class. We've done that in the Labour Party and lost elections on the back of that approach to it. So we've learnt those lessons as well. And that's what we're going into this election in the local elections, where we had the core offering, first, second, third, was cost of living related issues, then public services, then crime. Discipline campaign from north to south, right across the country. And then around it, obviously, local campaigns that extended that campaign really deeply into communities. And then, of course, we saw the opposite, and it was absolutely astonishing to us. I mean, genuinely, if like Boris Johnson, our WhatsApp messages were suddenly released during that campaign, it would be full of why aren't they talking about cost of living? Why aren't they talking about crime? Why aren't they talking about the issues that people repeatedly talk to us on the doorsteps about? There is nothing inevitable about winning or losing an election, nothing. And those local elections in England that we just had were very important for us because we reconnected in places we'd lost. We started going to places, metropolitan areas as well, such as in Brighton and Hove, the area that I was most involved in. We went from 16 to 38 councillors there, taking overall control for the first time in 22 years for any party there. So metropolitan areas like Plymouth and Brighton, traditional areas like Stoke and Middlesbrough where we took the mayor back, but crucially for us, because this campaign was a disciplined, focused one, actually places like the Medway, which were absolutely significant for us because these are places you only win when you pull voters in from all directions, and you go to places that you only win as a party when you are a party that is moving towards government. So these were very, very important for us. So in terms of going forward, we're not... We recognise that we've moved forward. I mentioned the 2019 general election, which I felt was irresponsible at the time. But the problem we've got with our politics at the moment is that our system is stuck between general elections. We don't have repeated elections in Westminster, so we still have the Parliament of 2019. So it was a very disruptive general election. There were people who came into Parliament from both parties and all across the House, all of the political divides, who had very ideological roots stemming from the debate around Brexit. But we now have that Parliament still today, which is why some of the issues have a more potency today and are still spoken about in our national debate, simply because people came into Parliament because they wanted to talk about nothing else, and they still wanted to talk about nothing else. And then, of course, we have a government which is drawn from Parliament. So we still, which is why we are so desperate. Our country needs a general election as soon as possible so that we can release that tension that is still baked into our politics and our political debate because of the Brexit and the fallout from it and the nature of our Westminster politics and where government comes from. We need that election so we can have the reset that our country needs. And I'll just finish on this because we mentioned Keir and Rishi Sunak and others. There is one key thing that the voters notice between the two of them. And this is something as we move towards the election that will have more and more salience. When Keir became leader, voters, whether they voted Labour in the past or not, the electorate was looking to Keir to fix the Labour Party. And he has, in a very demonstrable way. In the key areas, such as Jeremy Corbyn himself, a few legacy policy issues that he's dealt with, reorientating ourselves so we're facing the future, not stuck in the rows that we had as a party. Keir was not only doing what the decent thing and the right thing to do by traditional Labour values and principles was, he was also signalling very clearly to the electorate that he was on their side. Now, nobody, for example, will be able to say that Jeremy Corbyn will have any purchase over Keir as leader or Prime Minister, because he won't. Now, look at the Conservative Party. The closer we move to the election, more and more people will be looking at the nature of the leader of the Conservative Party, but they're also going to be looking at who is influencing him, who will have purchase over Rishi Sunak going forward. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is not going to be standing as a Labour MP, but Liz Truss will, Boris Johnson will, Kwasi Kwarteng will, and because Rishi Sunak has never been to the membership, he doesn't have the endorsement of the membership, and we know full well where the Conservative Party membership lies, there will be a cloud hanging over his ability to govern the country independently and in the interests solely of the of voters right across the country. And this is something which is going to be more and more prominent. You will not have photographs of Nicola Sturgeon with Keir Starmer in her pocket. Won't happen. And the same won't happen for anyone else, because nobody doubts he's his own man. But increasingly, that's going to be a danger for the first time in a long time with a Conservative Prime Minister. We will set about, we do have a lot of ambition for our future relationship with the EU. It's not all just grounded in Brexit, because there are things like AI, climate change, security, China, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The things that our partners, both in the United States and in Europe, want to talk about with Britain has changed fundamentally since those days. We also need to talk about the economic partnership and building so that two large economies that are actually on each other's doorstep are actually mutually more compatible and mutually more beneficial. And it's two economies that add up to more than the sum of its parts, which is what we need to do on a continent like Europe. It makes common sense. But we also need to work on those things which are future-facing, because that's how we become relevant as a country. That's why, when people want us to re-prosecute the arguments of the past, we're reluctant to. But every time we talk about increasing trade with the EU, every time we talk about opening up new opportunities for institutions like higher education and services sector, every time that we talk about tackling crime across the continent, working with our partners to deal with the big issues from cost of living through to asylum seekers and so forth, these are all legacy of Brexit in one way or another. It's framed in a forward-facing way. And with us, that is where the discipline comes in, because for us it is about the future and it's not about the past. Thank you.
Thank you. So the top two questions keep changing, and I'm going to ask it the one it was a couple of minutes ago, because in the interest of balance, it allows me to bring in some of the other parties as well. So the question is really, if I just paraphrase what's there, why aren't the Lib Dems doing better? And this was on the slide, this was specifically asked to John, so I'm going to go to John first. The other panellists, I'm going to direct specific questions to you. If you want to chip in on any of the others, please do. But in the interest of getting through as many questions as possible, I'm not going to direct every question to every panellist.
Okay, it's an important question, because usually what we expect to happen in the middle of a parliament when voters have become disenchanted with the Conservative government is that the Liberal Democrats profit. And if I were to perhaps make the strongest case for what Labour have managed to achieve in the last 4 years, it is that when the Conservatives got into trouble, and I think that frankly that's the thing that's helped Labour get to the position it's in, but that it is to Labour that the electorate have turned and have not, I mean, Liberal Democrats are hardly any better off now than they were back in the autumn of 2021. Why is that? Well, there's a variety of things we can talk about. I was intrigued, for example, in Seb's suggestion that we're about to head for a presidential election. I have to say, with all due respect to all three party leaders, all of whom are clearly highly competent people within their professions, is that when it comes to providing visionary politics, all three of them have a certain lack in that department. None of them at the moment are capable of doing the vision thing. And the truth is that for the Democrats in particular, electoral success does tend to rest very, very heavily on their having a charismatic leader who is able to grab attention for the party, etc., etc. And the honest truth is that whatever Sir Ed Davies' other qualities, that doesn't seem to be one of them. Certainly, I think it's no secret, and there's the odd story going around. I mean, the party itself has voted in favour of rejoining the European Union, although it said it might be a little while down the track. There is no doubt that there is pressure on Ed Davey, given the party's lack of progress, to come out in favour of saying, well, actually, we're in favour of rejoining sooner rather than later. If they were to do that, would have interesting questions about whether or not the Labour Party can maintain its current line in the way that it's currently able to do so, because there isn't any competition for the Remain vote, but who sees. But beyond that, I mean, beyond that, I think the other thing I would say about the Liberal Democrats, and this is, to my mind, their fundamental problem in December 2019. Their problem in December 2019 was not the idea of coming out in favour of saying, let's just cancel Brexit. That was fine. The problem is that was the only policy they had. They didn't have any other policies with which they were identified, whereas if you were a Remain-inclined voter, there were plenty of other policies, not all of whom, Peter, are exactly bad. I think the nationalisation of railways, probably a good idea, and it's effectively happened. Giving everybody broadband, an idea before its time, and we all wish that we had it 3 months later. So let's remember, not everything in the Labour Manifesto of 2019 was necessarily dotty or stupid.
I didn't say it was.
No, well, okay, fine. Well, you kind of pretty heavily distanced yourself from it. So that
as a whole.
So okay. So the point is, Labour did have another policy offering in addition to Brexit, and therefore Remain voters deciding between Labour and Liberal Democrats. Basically, Labour were able to pull back into the party those people who'd flirted with the Democrats the previous spring, and therefore avoided a potential worse disaster. So I think the other thing, so the Democrats have to decide what they're going to do about Brexit, and I've already shown you. I think that whereas Labour can argue that what they have done has been successful, though perhaps not in quite the way that they might like to think it's successful, the Democrats, in contrast, it is not obvious to me why their reluctance to talk about Brexit it makes sense, because it's not evidently brought them net electoral dividends so far. But that certainly would not be sufficient. They would also need to have a broader set of policies. And remember, they made their name very much in the beginning of this century by a penny on income tax for education, etc., etc. They adopted a very, very distinctive stance. They need to think of a distinctive stance that also attracts voters, and they've got to try and paint a picture of the kind of country they want in 2030. But that last point is a challenge on which I think all of our parties are currently failing.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to add anything on the Lib Dems? It's dangerous territory for some, I guess.
Speaks to the problem, really. I was going to say that speaks to the problem, really.
Okay. Yeah. I'll move on then to what's now the most popular question. I want these votes broken down by audience type, so that I can get a diverse set of questions. Do you think Slido can implement that for me? And it's Jill's question, which I'm going to ask first to Seb, I think, because I think it's most in your territory, which is, surely rejoin can only become an option when it becomes an option for the Conservatives, when the Conservatives become the party of rejoin. Is there any foreseeable prospect of that happening?
I'm sort of trying to think, what is that thick of it line? War is not foreseeable or unforeseeable. So I think, obviously, when I wrote my book, Broken Heartlands, which was about the kind of electoral realignment after 2016, and what I argued in that book was that there had been a decisive change in how the country had voted in terms of its voting coalitions, and you can argue in some respects that with the end of Boris Johnson and the Liz Truss interregnum, and where we are now, that we've actually gone, the realignment has kind of slightly unstitched, and we've gone slightly a bit more back to where we were in the past. John would be far better than me on that particular issue. But in terms of where Conservatives go, I think it's certainly if it was ever to become foreseeable, it would be a generational thing. And going back to the research we've done recently on millennials, obviously that is a generation that is more Remain aligned. But there's such a big jump, in my perspective, between people who say they would vote in or out, between actively wanting a referendum and then going through the referendum campaign and then rejoining. Like, there's about 5 steps to get through that. And you've got to remember in the last referendum how decisive the campaign was in sort of shifting opinions over in that period. I think for the Conservatives, obviously the party was in a very different place in the last referendum in 1975, when it was very much in favour of staying within the EEC at that point. Ultimately, I think I can't quite see those circumstances, because the voting coalitions John highlighted, they are the Brexit party in the sense that Brexit voters are overwhelmingly Conservative, and it would only be a generational change, which I can't quite foresee, of its voting base changing, its MPs changing, and ultimately most people sort of within the Conservative Party itself were pro-Brexit for almost for domestic reasons, for the opportunities you were talking about in terms of the state, in terms of the so-called Singapore-on-Thames, the liberal Brexit model, whereas obviously there were many other people in the country who voted Brexit for the Nigel Farage model of Brexit, which is quite different. And I think ultimately it would have to go through just a lot of permutations to get there.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody want to add anything to this?
Kelly, did you want to say?
No. I think just my only reflection to add to what you've said is about the value of referendums and whether our politicians themselves will need to go through a generational change before they're really likely to put their foot into the camp of holding another referendum about a very serious public issue where the public are largely divided. I think there will have been lessons learnt all round about that.
I think that's true. I just want to follow up on the Lib Dem thing. If the Lib Dems do come out for rejoining, as a priority, John, you said that it would be difficult, it might pose difficult questions for Labour. It really wouldn't, and let me explain why. Every time something big happens, whether it's an economic shock, whether it's a pandemic, whether it is a big political moment, the landscape changes. The political landscape that you're standing on changes. And when I was elected in 2015, and of course the political landscape changed around the referendum. If I look about those moments afterwards, the Chequers deal, when that landed, the political landscape changed at that moment. I mean, nobody was talking about, everyone until that point was talking about, do we want a soft Brexit? Do we want a Norway-style deal? It was all about whether we stay in the single market. I mean, in that period, don't forget, I voted for Brexit more often than Boris Johnson did, because I was trying to sort of steer Brexit. I wasn't trying to stop it, but the Brexit, the Chequers deal, changed the landscape that we were standing on, because everyone hated it. Everyone. 232 she lost by. For an unprecedented moment. The landscape changed. And then, of course, we go into the 2019 general election. The landscape changed. So, I was a Remainer. I fought for Remain. I felt it very, very sharply and emotionally. But I sort of, for want of a better word, my grieving for that moment and the battle that we lost, it wasn't the day we left the EU. It was on the day we lost the election in 2019. In that moment afterwards, not only did I wake up and some of my closest friends had lost their seats, people who were genuinely decent people, who were good, hard-working MPs and advocates for their constituencies, but we also lost the fight decisively, and we handed Boris Johnson on a plate any Brexit he chose to deliver, and we lost all agency as a result. That was the moment that I grieved and moved forward, and the weeks and months that followed that was just simply me trying to understand what the landscape was that we were standing on now, and how we adapt to it, and how we face the future from the moment we're standing on. So where we are now, it is about fixing the big issues that our country faces. It is about the cost of living challenge. Now, of course, there is a Brexit element to it, because we do need to increase trade. A third fewer businesses are trading with the EU. That's not good. We've had £7 million worth of barriers put into the economy just to deliver the economy we have at the moment, unnecessarily, as a result of the deal that we have. Coming this December, there's all of the grace period, the next round of grace periods are going to come to an end. So things like, if you want to bring Gorgonzola cheese in from any EU member state, you're going to have a certificate from a veterinary organisation. That's going to bring in another £1 billion worth of barriers in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So, the political landscape now is about fixing some of these challenges, creating new opportunities going forward. But if you don't stand on the political landscape as it is, but you try and fight from a one that you wish it was, you will get clobbered. And if the Lib Dems didn't learn that in the 2019 general election, then believe me, it will be existential for them going forward.
The argument on the other side, Peter, you're quite right, and I said this right at the beginning, right? The economy is the central issue, or indeed I put it slightly strongly. The central issue facing this country is a fiscal crisis. We have basically maxed out the credit card. We are in the midst of suffering the biggest decline in living standards in recorded history, and the public services don't work, and we have a record level of taxation, right? Good luck to you if you are indeed the next administration. But then the question then is, what do we do about it? And obviously, the reason why Brexit is as unpopular as it now is almost undoubtedly because of the economic situation that we are now in, and that whatever the fine arguments that we heard earlier about, well, to what extent is it Ukraine and to what extent is it pandemic or whatever, it's become very, very difficult for Brexiteers to be able to persuade people that Brexit is economically successful given the conjunction of events. And therefore, the question that therefore will arise is whether or not reversing Brexit, or at least softening Brexit, which some of what you've just said perhaps suggested you might want to move in the direction of, as to whether or not that is or is not as regarded as an integral part of dealing with the fiscal crisis that we now face. And to that extent, at least, to suggest that the economy is more important than Brexit is potentially a false dichotomy. The question is to what extent, given the conjunction of events, given the extent to which Brexit is now regarded economically unpopular, whether you can persuade the public that being able to deal with the fiscal crisis effectively can be done without effective action on changing our relationship with the European Union.
Just to clarify one point, I mean, I did say that we're not going to talk about Brexit in the terms that it was spoken in the past, but it is intrinsic to how we move forward. So when we talk about fighting crime, when we talk about building trade, that is Brexit, but it's set in the context from which we are going forward. We're not going to have a separate category for Brexit policy. It will be integrated into all forms because it is now Brexit. We're not living in a post-Brexit world. We're just living in the future. So all of these things are just going to be, integrated right the way through all of our policy debates going forward. And we have to accept that reality. One thing that frustrated me so much during the Brexit period, the run-up to the referendum, was every problem that our country faced, every challenge we face as a country, the Brexiteers says there was one solution to it, and that was leaving. Now, what I don't want is Remainers to have the equal opposite, and to say every problem and challenge our country faces now has one solution, rejoining, because it's not realistic. I am very, very realistic because I study this in so much detail, not as much as some people here, but I live and breathe this and take it very earnestly, understanding what the true nature of the damage to the British economy and society and opportunities for people who live here are caused by Brexit and how we can move forward from it. But to suggest that every one of those solutions, during that referendum campaign, I was so careful with my language. I never said that the heavens will open up. I never said that it would be economic catastrophe. What I said was that we will have to work harder as a country to achieve the same outside of the EU than we did inside the single market. And I think that is broadly what we are experiencing. There are ways to mitigate it. There are ways that we can invest in new technologies, that we can find new specialisms as a country, new things that we can invest in to get our economy fit for the future. But we have to be much smarter in the way we do it. The margin for error that we have as an economy has narrowed because of Brexit, which just means we have to get it right. We have to get it right, and the margin for error has narrowed since Brexit, and we have to accept that. And that's why I believe another 5 years of constitutional debate would distract us really fundamentally from the core purpose and the opportunities we do have before us.
Thank you. I think we'll move on from that because we're in danger of straying back to the last panel. So I'm going to run a couple of questions together here because I think they actually highlight the sort of horns of the dilemma for Labour. And I'm going to give this one to you first, Kelly, just so you're prepared while I'm speaking. Okay. So the first one, I'm going to read the question out as it is, and then I'm going to give you the other side to see how you can deal with it. So the question, the most popular question at the moment is, as the British public have seemingly realised that Brexit is damaging the UK economy, and I don't really want an economic answer to this, why can't Sir Keir see this? And the other question, which was asked very early on, is it true that Labour will get more Westminster seats by supporting Brexit? And I feel that those two questions taken together kind of highlight the horns of the dilemma that Labour have found themselves stuck in for some time now.
Yes, I think the reason he's probably not focusing on it so much is because it is quite a toxic argument still. And I've looked at a lot of the polling that others have done as well as our own on the rejoin, stay out, the debates about going back in, and it becomes quite a convoluted data space actually. What we do see clearly is when we ask the public about whether they think working closely with Europe and that relationship is important, the overwhelming majority, not a small majority, an overwhelming majority say the relationship with the EU is really important. So I think the focus on shaping the relationship with the EU and delivering that well for Britain is probably a very sensible approach if you're trying to navigate, which is a very toxic, and Brexit did become quite a toxic debate in Britain, and still tensions continue today. So I think the way in which Labour are trying to navigate that at the minute, to me, makes a lot of sense, based on the perceptions that we gather from the British public, and whether or not it would gain them seats to say, I'm not convinced, actually. I'm not convinced. I think the navigation of we're focusing on that relationship, focusing on what priorities matter for the British public in managing that relationship is probably the best approach.
Thank you. John, did you want to add anything? Because that's very much in your territory, that question.
Yeah, well,
I mean, the seats one. Yes.
Look, the reason, I mean, one of the important reasons, I mean, Peter acknowledged it, nobody prompted him, Peter openly acknowledged it. He said that one of the big things that upset him about the December 2019 general election was losing places like Stoke and the so-called Red Wall. And the honest truth is that one of the reasons why Labour Party came out of elections so uncomfortable in 2019 is that a party that was founded to represent people in working class occupations, working class people, found itself less popular than the Conservative Party amongst working class people, and that the party is not comfortable with finding itself as the party of young middle-class professionals, particularly those living in London, which is what it has now become. If I were to try to say, what is the core Labour demographic now? It's no longer the working class, which of course is also, by the way, much smaller than it once was. So again, you know, think about where we're at now, Peter, rather than where we were 50 years ago. But that actually, you know, young middle-class professionals are the group that are above all most likely to vote for Labour, but that just was not something that Labour finds itself comfortable with. If it's not doing well in working class areas, it finds itself difficult. So I think, you know, there is, as Peter acknowledged, there is an important emotional argument behind all this. I mean, the argument that's used, and it's not an unreasonable argument, about why not saying too much about Brexit and certainly not suggesting going back to the single market of the customs union makes sense, Labour Party, is, I mean, to be honest, it's no longer about whether the Labour Party can get back the Red Wall seats. The Red Wall seats are all very marginal. Unless something really dramatic happens, they're all going to go back to the Labour Party because it will just need a kind of normal national swing, and the Labour Party will get all these Red Wall seats back, although they still will not be as safe as perhaps the Labour Party would like them to be. But it's also true much more broadly. If you take the 160 odd seats that Labour needs to pick up to get to 326, given where they're at the moment, you know, on average, they voted about 55-56% Leave in 2016. So the question, so the argument therefore is that given this is a somewhat more Leave voting part of the country, you've therefore got to craft a message that doesn't doesn't inhibit you from winning voters in that part of the world. Now, where you can then begin to have interesting arguments, of course, what you actually discover is that even in Leave voting areas, the Labour vote is more disproportionately Remain voting vote than it is a Leave voting vote. So you can actually win so-called Leave constituencies by getting a coalition of Remain voters. And secondly, of course, while these constituencies might have been 55%, 56% Leave back in 2016, if you accept the kind of polling we got now, they're probably at least 50-50, if that, on average. So the truth is that the calculations that made sense in the circumstances of, you know, March 2020, some of those have now moved on, and in a sense, part of the reason why people keep on kind of asking, well, why aren't Labour changing their mind, is that perhaps some people feel, rightly or wrongly, I'm not taking a stance here, that perhaps circumstances have moved on electorally in the last 2 years, such that what perhaps made sense then maybe no longer necessarily makes sense now.
Thanks. I haven't mentioned complacency yet. I mean, I hear all this, you know, if things just happen, then all naturally some of these Red Wall seats will come back to us. We know that we've still got a lot of work to do. We know it, particularly if you're in the shadow cabinet, because Keir mentions it 10 times every day. And we have this thing now, and when we have conversations with Keir, we have to frame it in a way of like, if we do this, and if we do that, and if we manage to get the hard work done here, and we do the deep drilling here, we come up with the policy here, and if that happens, do you think from a position of government we could, you know, you have to go through this, because otherwise he will literally bite your head off. Wes Streeting has a joke that if we got £1 for every time Keir shouts at us about complacency, we could pay Nadine Zahawi's tax bill. And I've credited Wes to a joke there, which galls me secondly.
Can you pay his inheritance tax bill?
That's another. That would be another thing altogether. So, but look. So you know, about Keir, and does he get it? I mean, he gets it, and he's. What we've come to the conclusion of is that if the problem is division, the solution is not just pick a side. If the problem is we are inheriting and we are living in a world where our country is still divided and suffering the consequences of division, the solution is not to pick a side. It's to try and find ways that we can move forward, that can heal and bring people together. There were lots of aspects of the more we drill into what happened in the local elections in England last month, there are things in there that rewarded very, very knowing strategies from us. So John is absolutely right. You know, we were deeply wounded when we lost, when the Tories won more working class votes than we did in the 2019 general election. In the local elections, we actually won every single demographic across England. And that was a huge moment for us. This is something we've spoken about a lot, because we don't just want to get back into power by appealing to one demographic at the expense of another, by telling one side that they're right and sneering at the others. There's too much of that in our politics. And I think whether you like Keir or not, whether you like Labour Party or not, I think when you look at him and you look at the way we aspire to be as a party, you see people and you see a party which is aspiring to bring people back together again and end the rowing. And one of the things that comes up consistently when you speak to voters and you listen to voters and you see some of the polling research, you consistently see that people want the rowing to stop and they want policies that can unite us again and give us a clarity of purpose as a country. You can't do it if you're only governing for one part of the country and that demographic is split quite randomly across the country, and therefore you are constantly reinforcing division as a tool towards electoral success. As we've seen with populists around the world, whether it be Berlusconi, Bolsonaro, or whether you see Boris Johnson, these people have a strength of personality that can assemble a very, very eclectic coalition of support, but it's very, very difficult to do so for very long, because ultimately it just falls apart. The thing about Boris Johnson was just how fast that coalition fell apart. We are going back to our starting point is not to try and reassemble another odd coalition based on those categories I keep talking about, but to do so by having a central offering with a clarity of purpose for the country that will deliver a vision for a better Britain, to do so that can pull people back together again. That's what we aspire to do. We know that it's being rewarded in the steps that we are taking forward, but we also know we do have quite a way to go, and we're certainly not resting on our laurels.
Thank you. Can I bring Seb in on that? Because obviously a few mentions of the Red Wall there. Will you be revisiting them to write Rebuilt Heartlands
in a personal way, I think you will.
Well, I mean, after I'd done the book on the Red Wall, there was a Tory strategist who said, "You and your effing walls, mate, they're just seats." And that actually speaks to what John is saying, that, you know, in some sense, having these demarcations helps understand the place and try and find different trends. And when I went round the 10 places I highlighted in the book, there were some consistencies. They all had their individual attributes. You know, I broadly found there were two categories of the 44 Red Wall seats that I identified. Some were more urban, some were more rural. I thought the more rural ones would be stickier towards the Conservatives and the more urban ones would go straight back. But as you were saying, when you've got the poll leaders as they are at the moment, none of it really matters because it just sort of takes out everything in a way. But if the polls do tighten, which I'm pretty certain they will when we get towards an election, it will be interesting to see how that does pan out. You know, there's these, there was an MRP out quite recently I looked at and showed that Great Yarmouth, which is a seat that was, we would have called a classic marginal. I think it was Labour 97 to 2010. I hope that's right, John. But that actually stays Conservative at the moment, and maybe it's the prowess of Brandon Lewis in his campaigning there, or it may be that there has still some latent realignment from 2016, that in fact that the Conservatives are still appealing more to those particular parts of the country. And to Peter's point about having a big overarching message, of course every political party aspires to that. Every political party wants to win everywhere. But that's impossible in practice. Every political leader has to make decisions about who and where they're going to appeal to, and all parties will ultimately do that while trying to maximise the coalition if possible. And I think one thing that's missed quite a lot in 2019 is the secret of the Get Brexit Done slogan was not just convincing Brexiters, it was convincing Remainers, and it was saying to those Conservative Remainers who have remained very steady in John's voting, is to say, we're going to get this thing off your table so we can get on with other stuff. That election wasn't just about that issue. It was actually about getting to what Boris Johnson called the people's priorities. I think Rishi Sunak still used the people's priorities thing, because ultimately, if you think about what people want from their politicians, they basically want politics out of their lives. They don't want to think about it, and they want to get on doing what they're doing. And they look to politicians to try and do that, not bicker on themselves. And one of the most powerful election messaging from 2019 was the arguing about arguing, and it was a party political broadcast by the Conservatives that encapsulated the message at that point, which was to really say, look, this is a whole thing about saying these politicians are just talking among themselves. Ultimately, if you vote for us to get Brexit done, we can get on with other stuff. And when we get to the next election, it'll be up to the voters to decide, have they got on with the other stuff, however you define it, minus a war in Europe and a pandemic. But the one thing that I think is always missed in these conversations is people vote on the future. The atmospherics of the past are important, the atmospherics of the present are very important, but the future is where they are fundamentally focused, and it's what is this person going to do for me and do to my family, and whoever can make the most convincing argument with the most convincing personality wins. And if you strip it all back down, it just comes to that.
I'm looking forward to a very peaceful general election, because I think we've got our two political representatives both saying we don't want division. Will be the
Heaven
first
forbid.
election in which that happened.
It's exactly how it's going to be, Peter, isn't it?
Exactly.
It'll be vigorous.
I'm aware that the time is running on, and there's some really good questions here that I would like us to get to. The one that's most important at the moment is about the Brexit implications for the Union of the UK, which I think should be a panel of its own. And I think if we start to get into that now, we might not get to anything else. So I shall apologise for not asking that one directly right now. You can look at some of the UK and a Change in Europe reports on that issue if that's the question that's most important to you. But I would like to make the best use of our panel by asking them some of the other questions. So the next question that I would like to ask, and again I'm going to come to you first, Kelly, because I think you probably have done some polling in this area. The Labour Party want to extend the franchise to EU citizens and 16-year-olds. And the question is, how will this influence British politics? Which is a pretty big question.
I'm not sure I am the best.
You're not best placed to answer that? Okay, I can come to somebody else then. John, you're perhaps
Yeah, it
quite
so happens I recently wrote about this. The question you have to ask yourself is this. Why is it that somebody who comes to the United Kingdom to live and work from Windsor, Ontario, is allowed to vote in our parliamentary elections, but somebody who comes across from Detroit, Michigan, just the other side of the border, is not able to do so? That is the current position, and that would still be the position under Sir Keir Starmer's proposal. I think perhaps what's been missed is that actually the debate has moved on quite considerably in other parts of the Union, so we can still talk about other than England. Both in Scotland and in Wales, the devolved institutions have already basically decided that citizenship should no longer be the criterion that defines the franchise. In both places now, apart from reducing voting to age 16, they have made permanent residence, irrespective of citizenship, the criterion for voting in Welsh and Scottish local and devolved elections. And to that extent, at least, the debate at Westminster, which is, the UK government has just extended the franchise for British citizens living abroad basically in perpetuity. And now Labour saying, well, why don't we get the EU citizens allowed to vote, which they weren't actually allowed to do so in parliamentary elections when we were inside the European Union, is on both sides is tinkering. At the end of the day, we need to make a fundamental question. Is the basis of voting in the UK citizenship, in which case we should be asking questions about why it is that Commonwealth citizens are able to vote, or is it to be residents, in which case then it isn't no longer just EU citizens living here, it's everybody who's living here. But at the moment we're still getting both sides trying to tinker about the franchise. You might have seen when the Keir Starmer's proposal came out, some enormous numbers about the difference it would make to the franchise. I think, if I remember rightly, in the end, going through quite a lot of work, and it's not very easy to do. I think at the moment, we've got about 2 million EU citizens on the local government franchise, so maybe it would go up a bit for parliamentary elections. My best estimate is that because a lot of people who come to the UK who are non-EU citizens to live and work fairly rapidly become British citizens, you might be adding no more than about 1 million people if we allowed all permanent residents to go onto the register. So, sure, EU citizens are probably not going to be that well disposed towards the Conservative Party at the moment. But, I mean, don't exaggerate the numbers, and B, probably the honest truth is we now need to sort out, we're still operating basically on the legacy of empire. We need to be clear what are the criteria that by which we are going to allow people to exercise the franchise, and then we should apply those criteria consistently. At the moment, we're getting both sides coming up with inconsistent tinkering of the system.
Are we all good on that one?
Yeah, the only thing, I mean, it's nice because I feel at moments like that I'm in the audience too. But the only thing I'll add to it is about votes to 16. And I always struggle to see why it's so seen as, it sounds more radical than it actually is, for two reasons. Firstly, as John said, for the Welsh Zenith, for the Scottish Parliament, but also across the Channel Islands, 16-year-olds can already vote. And nobody has ever come forward to say that that has had a negative or distortive impact on democracy in any of those areas. It's not as radical as it sometimes sees. Now, if you accept the premise, unless people are going to be consistent and say, I don't think that 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds should be able to vote in parliamentary elections, then, unless you're going to say you therefore think they shouldn't vote in other elections across the UK, for local elections and regional elections, then it doesn't seem consistent to me, unless you can make the argument to evidence the position. Because personally, I think if you're educated to GCSE level, then I think you have all of the critical thinking and ability to judge manifestos and the character of people standing that others do. And then secondly, the reason why it's not as radical as people think is that we have 5-year parliaments. So right now, let's say we have an election next week. If you have your 18th birthday today, if you have an election this week, but you have your 18th birthday next week, then you're going to be 23 by the time you have the opportunity to vote for the first time. So just because an 18-year-old is enfranchised doesn't mean that they're going to be able to vote in a parliamentary election for perhaps 5 years after they turn 18. And it's the same for 16, 17-year-olds. So only, if it's a 5-year parliament, only about 20% of 16, 17-year-olds or 16-year-olds would be able to vote in that actual election. You're also actually enfranchising 18, 19 and 20-year-olds. And that's the crucial thing. Because right now, there are a substantial number of 18, 19 and 20-year-olds who are unable to vote simply because of the point in the electoral cycle that they turned 18. We know for an absolute cast iron fact that the younger you cast your first vote, the more likely you are to vote for the rest of your life. And we have a real problem in the way that the democratic the habits that people have in this country. Not enough people vote or see voting as part of their natural character of life. I feel so strongly about this, I introduced the Private Members Bill for votes at 16. And so, for those reasons, and we will be a government that at least is going to be striving to see how we extend the franchise. And I think this is the first time in our actual history we're in a period where you have a government that is actually restricting access to voting, which we've seen with voter ID. And that's something that should worry us very much.
Thank you.
Is that a 16-year-old at the back?
There's somebody without a passport. I want to finish with this last question. We do need to wrap up, so we could all, I suspect, myself included, talk about this next question for quite a long time, but if we could try and keep the responses within the time available. So, the question really quite basically is, what can go wrong for Labour between now and the next general election?
I think we should let Peter take that question.
Well, I know more than everyone else. It's like, because I'm a Labour Party MP, I'm a Labour Party member. I've seen us lose election after election after election. You only have to look to the last 3 general elections to see what can go wrong. But as I said consistently to Labour Party members and to groups like this, I think it's quite easy to answer the 2019 question, which Keir did within a couple of weeks of becoming leader. But we also had to answer the 2017 election, the 2015 question, and answering the 2015 question as to why Labour lost, and then, crucially, the 2010 election where we lost to the coalition, has been much more challenging for us as a party. It means that we've had to go much deeper into our character as a party, as our policy offering, the way that we transact our politics, the way that we engage with people who voted against us in the past. Too often in the past, we've thought that we can just win elections by just, uniting the progressive vote and attracting a few more young people, without actually having to bother us to dirty ourselves by going out there and talking to Tories. My experience in Hove, when I took the seat off the Tories in 2015 in Hove, is that getting out there, listening to people who voted differently to you and the way you have done or would have done in the past, actually is where the learning is. And setting about showing that your values and principles as a party and your priorities as a party will tackle other people's priorities and is best suited to tackle other people's and the country's priorities is what we should be doing. And that's what I mean about having this psychology of going for a core offering rather than just trying to tick boxes, because too often it leads you to the conclusion that you can just assemble this coalition without actually tackling the core issues that are affecting people from other parties. So I think that the key thing is that we've learned with Keir is that we are out there, working really, really hard to show that there's nowhere that's off limits for us. We're certainly not having a strategy which lost us the two elections in 2010 and 2015, where we actually thought we could assemble a coalition that meant we didn't have to engage with Tories. We've learnt those lessons, and you're seeing it transacted quite efficiently and effectively in local elections this year, in a most pronounced way. But you're going to see that developing going forward. But there are lots and lots and lots of hurdles we have to get over before that. And believe me, none of us know that more than those of us who work around Keir, because we get the earful every day from him.
Since we started, Peter, I'm going to go back through my panellists in reverse order that we started, so I'll go to you.
Thank you. When I look at where the polls are and things at the moment, it sort of feels almost as if a lot of people have switched off party politics, and that Labour's lead at the moment is almost sort of calcified for a while, that it set in late last year after the Liz Truss era, and, Rishi Sunak has pulled it back, quite substantially. The Conservative Party was on 19% in the polls. It's now on 28%, the give or thereabouts around where you look. So that's not an insubstantial thing he's managed to do in about 6 months, given the economic headwinds he's dealing with at the moment. So I think it's completely plausible and likely that the polls will further tighten towards the election. A lot of it is going to depend on the economy, and as we've seen with inflation being harder to crack than I think some people thought, it's not entirely within the government or the Prime Minister's control to get that back to a situation where people are feeling more prosperous again. But I think ultimately Mr Sunak is trying to sell himself as a problem solver to the country. I think in a column in the Times I liken him to a corporate restructuring consultant who comes into a business that's struggling and tries to turn the whole thing around. And the real question is going to be how much can be done by the time we get to an election. It's still a long way away, by the way, that we're still 18 months likely before we're going to go to the polls, and if we wanted to, you could have a whole other pandemic in that time, which is they're not wishing that on, obviously, of course. But I think it is very easy that people felt for quite a long time we're on the precipice of an election. We really are not. There's still a long time for things to happen. Many different events that we can't quite foresee at the moment. But I think ultimately for the government, the aim is to just keep plugging away, keep trying to improve the economy. I think when inflation comes down, things will start to ease up with the cost of living crisis, and the same with energy prices. But again, that's outside the government's control. A lot of that is related to the war in Ukraine, and trying to solve some of those knots of public services that you've got big problems with the NHS backlogged, which again, there's no magic wand to solve that. You've got big issues with just generally the dissatisfaction with things not working in the country, and again, you can't just wave a magic wand. But I think if you can make progress on that, you can make progress on the economy, and show, to go back to the presidential point, that in some ways what you're saying to the country is not this is the 5th term of the Conservatives, but this is the 1st term of a Rishi Sunak government who has proven that he can turn things around, he can improve things, and I think things will get very different to where they are now. So that's the case of why things could go wrong for Labour if things start to go right for the Conservatives.
So I think there's probably two big things. One is that whilst Labour are really seen as a government in waiting, public expectation and therefore judgment is also treating them like a government in waiting. And you're seeing also the news, we also track the news articles and the topics that are covered by the press, and you can see a more mixed sentiment around Labour today actually than you may have seen even 12 months ago. So they are being judged more harshly perhaps than an average opposition party, because they are perceived to be fit to govern. So if that becomes more harsh as time goes on, obviously that pressures Labour's voting intention. On the other side, and Seb touched on this a little bit, it is if the Conservatives really demonstrate that they are capable of delivering. That is the core delivery. I mentioned it in my presentation. Who can actually deliver? And the cost of living stuff, hopefully, and as most of the indicators show, will subside as we go into the back end of this year and into 2024. So what does that mean? Well, it means Conservative Party could potentially point to that as an area where they have moved the dial successfully. But look what was beneath those top issues in my issues index that I showed you earlier. It was public services. And they have to move the dial on those as well, because they will immediately move up to the top box. They definitely will. NHS, yes, it is up there, but by historical standards, that's still relatively low for people's concern on the NHS. It's just because it's overpowered by concern about cost of living, which people are feeling very hard in their pockets at the minute. So if that happens, actually NHS and public services tend to be a bit of a Labour area for success and potential public success, but Conservatives will be very much focused on delivering there too. So those two things, one can move the dial for the Conservatives and help to narrow that gap, and the other one unfortunately could close that gap on Labour's behalf. So I think those two things specifically.
Thank you. John, I can give you minus 1 minute.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I've got that message. Very briefly, the chances of the Conservatives forming the next administration are extremely low, not simply because what they need to do in order to get back to winning an overall majority is such a substantial long way away from where they are at the moment, but also because the Conservatives do not have any friends inside the House of Commons, and the moment they fall below about 315 seats, they will not be able to sustain a minority administration. Labour do not need to be the biggest party in the next Parliament in order to form a minority administration. However, what I think is still by no means certain, and I suspect here Peter and I, although he won't admit it quite this way, are of one mind, is that while Labour are odds-on favourites to form the next administration, whether or not they will be able to do so with an overall majority is still the $64,000 question. And for Labour, the difference between a hung parliament, a parliament in which it has an overall majority and therefore can try to ride out and deal with what is a very substantial fiscal crisis with a 4 or 5 year time scan is arguably still difficult, but it's going to be an awful lot better than trying to deal with a fiscal crisis in the middle of a deeply hung parliament, in which you know that if at some point you need to turn to one or other of the minority parties and do a deal, the choice is which do you prefer, proportional representation or a referendum on Scottish independence.
Thank you, John. So I'd like to thank my panellists. Thank you for the questions. There's some questions we haven't got to that I would have liked to have had a stab at, if I'm honest. Apologise once again for not covering Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in any detail. Please do, though, keep watching this space, because we will be having lunchtime sessions, and I'm sure we'll have one on Scottish politics and Northern Irish politics in the coming weeks to plug that particular gap. Please thank my panellists and stick around for the keynote.